Montana Committee for the Humanities for help sponsoring our event, and also for Montana EPSCoR, which is help sponsoring our event. But at this time, I'm going to turn the introduction of our speaker, Andrew Light, who I'm thrilled to have. Andrew's really a good friend and really nice to have out there. And Albert Boardman's going to take this.
I've been asked to introduce Andrew. I was asked 5 minutes ago. So in one sense, I'm totally unprepared. In another sense, I'm very well prepared. I'm unprepared in that I didn't have a chance to check on Andrew's most recent list of publications. I can tell you it's long and distinguished. There are dozens of books that this young man has authored, co-authored, and edited. And there are many, many more articles that he has published. Prominently influential articles. He is the editor of a journal. But I'm well prepared in the sense that I've had a long and wonderful friendship with Andrew. I forget how I first got to know Andrew. Very early in our friendship, he took a very generous interest in my work, and I in his. And Andrew is sort of at the very leading edge of a cohort of philosophers and social theorists who give me hope that the academic enterprise is not going to be for naught. Andrew is a philosopher, and he has worked in political theory, philosophy of technology. He has worked in environmental ethics. He lectures at the law school at the University of Washington. And all this is tied together by a passion to understand what's really going on today in our society, what matters, what's dangerous, what's hopeful. And in addition to the passion that he brings to this, he has enormous learning and a wonderful high degree of scholarship. Andrew travels all over. Everybody knows Andrew. And so it is with great pleasure that I give you Andrew and his topic on the future of environmental ethics in an age of global warming. Andrew.
Thank you, Albert. It's so great to be back here in Montana with my friend and former colleague Albert Boardman. Many of you know I started my academic career here, and especially it's great to be back here on a weekend when there's so many other good friends from around, Paul Thompson and Clark Wolf, and there's just too many, Alan Thompson, too many people in the audience to even acknowledge. So it's great to be back, and thanks again for Dane Scott and Christopher Preston and everyone behind at the Center for Ethics behind this fantastic tradition. I think we've done this twice now, this sort of Environmental Ethics Institute. So I think it's officially a tradition, right? So you're come of age, Mazel Tov. My topic tonight is a new one for me to talk about global warming. It's certainly not a new topic by environmental ethicists, but it has been one. It's a topic that very few environmental ethicists have actually said much about. And partly tonight I'm going to explain why I think that's the case, and why, if environmental ethics as it's traditionally been conceived, especially in the New World countries in North America and Australia, how it needs to change in order to deal with what I think is the most pressing and dire and overwhelming environmental problem that we're going to face as a people and as a set of generations who really, it's now or never. We really have to do something now, or things will get much worse in the future for the people that will come later. So what I'm going to do in order to sort of assess the future of environmental ethics faced with the challenge of global warming is first go back to, if you were here last year, we had a panel discussion on this white paper that was written in 2004 called The Death of Environmentalism, and I'll give some background to that and explain it. A very important document that was sort of a call that was thrown down by two very important environmental lobbyists, Michael Schellenberg and Ted Nordhaus, about how the environmental movement in America is failing, focusing on our failure to get traction on global warming. not laying it all to blame on the Dick Cheneys of the world or the Karl Roves, but really what we had done as environmentalists to not get traction on this question. And I think they put this in a very interesting way, three sort of problems involved with how we sort of thought about environmentalism, not only in relation to global warming, but writ large. These are called the category problems, the framing problem, and the vision problem, and then I'm going to take these one by one, and in the second and third parts of my talk about how I think environmental ethics, as it's traditionally been conceived, has been somewhat guilty of continuing these problems, this category problem and the framing problems with different sort of distinctions that have developed in the field. And then finally, I'm going to take on what I think is the most interesting topic in their paper, and I think one of the most interesting topics that ethicists can add to the debate on global warming. What is the vision that we're going to set out for the future so that people have some degree of responsibility and some degree of hope that they should and can take on a problem of the enormous size of global warming in the face of the uncertainties that we see for how things are going to evolve in the future. Now, before I do all of that, which is a lot, but before I do all of that, just a couple this is not as sophisticated as Al Gore's PowerPoint. I don't have sort of a ladder to go up and sort of go on the scale or anything like that. I don't have a Hollywood producer, but I've got some interesting slides just to remind us of the current state of the science and where we are. So these are familiar, these should be sort of familiar images. This, of course, is this is not working, but on the left, the Keeling curve, which originally sort of laid out the cycle of the continuing warming trend. This was the curve that Al Gore first encountered when he was an undergraduate and convinced him, or started to convince him, of the importance of taking on this issue. And to the right is an interesting diagram that was put about the sort of the mounting calamities of the calamities of a variety of sorts: earthquakes, tidal waves, tsunamis, extreme temperatures, droughts, things that we certainly don't need any reminders of now, that coincide with the Keeling curve. And of course, it's published by that environmental rag Fortune magazine. So, not a very reputable source, right, but still something kind of interesting. Now, one of the problems with taking on global warming now is that, as climatologists will put it, the oceans are kind of a memory of what we do. And even in the best case scenarios, if we were to stop carbon emissions or put them all at sort of zero emissions right now, we would still see effects in terms of sea level rise, because the sea level rise has already been impacted by the past warming trends that have occurred prior to us. And of course, that would be a best case scenario. But a friend of mine, Jeff Keel from NCAR, put this, sent this slide to me and just sort of show you that even if we get some kind of stabilization of climate, we still get to see a sea level rise and then all the possible consequences that could follow from that. And then now, what has been the sort of the poster child of global warming recently, and you certainly saw this in the Gore film, is of course Katrina. And this has been one of the attempts, I think, that the environmental movement has made, is to use Katrina as sort of the canary in the coal mine. This is sort of shows us exactly where we are and how disastrous things are going to be. These are photos that David Orr, who's head of environmental studies at Oberlin, shared with me from that he took just last year. Well, these are immediately after, but you'll see some photos that were taken just last year in New Orleans, and still, not so far in the past, you still see this immense devastation that's still wrought by there. David said he couldn't resist taking this one. So. Here we are inside of a house. You can see, just imagine the people who were in this house who had to knock a hole there. You can see the hole up on the left-hand side, just to immediately escape in the same way that people are escaping just down the valley now from the forest fires that are raging in Montana. We sort of are all familiar now with the projections on a number of different scales of where we're going into the future and the hot times that are ahead of us. This is a really interesting, I think, slide that sort of shows hurricane tracks from 1985 to 1994. It's kind of barely visible, but in the upper left-hand corner, you can sort of see what you've got is the Caribbean here. And these are the tracks of hurricanes from 85 to 94, with a thick part of the track being where the sort of the most severe part of the hurricane was. And then we see 95 to 2005. One of the problems with the environmental community focusing on Katrina, of course, was that in this part of the world, the next year was sort of a very sort of slim year for hurricanes. There wasn't a lot of worry. People didn't sort of mention so much, and Al Gore reminds us this in the sort of the director's cut, or the director's sort of afterwards of the DVD version of An Inconvenient Truth, that of course the next year was the worst year on record for hurricanes in Australia. But of course this wasn't recognized because they don't call them hurricanes there, they call them cyclones. As one of my students in my class said, because they go in the other direction, so they can't be the same phenomenon, clearly. And now we see sort of since 2005, climatologists have really gone out and started to talk about the possible relationship between global warming and the increasing destructiveness of cyclones and hurricanes. Here's we sort of saw that earlier slide on how the oceans are going to be the memory of what we've done already, even without any further increase in mean average temperature. Here's 1 meter at Katrina. If you get some of the worst predictions, this is where you go. And this is an interesting, David Orr used this slide to talk to, he's on the board of the sort of the environmental board for Walmart, right? So when he took this slide and showed it to the people at Walmart, he sort of also had pinpointed here all the sort of the locations of all the Walmarts in the area. He said, look, if we get this, you guys have got to get into the, the boat docking business, because, the Walmarts aren't going to survive. And this has gotten certainly the business community to pay attention. Now, with that as sort of just a prelude, what do these two environmental lobbyists, Ted Nordhaus and Michael Schellenberg, have to say? And I owe these next few slides to Dane Scott, who put these together for our panel discussion last year. Schellenberg is executive director of the Breakthrough Institute. Nordhaus was vice president of one of the leading opinion research funds. And they were commissioned by the Nathan Cummings Foundation in New York to write a kind of an assessment of how good the environmental organizations were doing so far, to be presented at the Environmental Grant Makers Association, which is a yearly conference of all the big endowments who give money to environmental organizations. And they really were sort of the fly in the ointment, or the people sort of really spoiling the party, because here it is, this meeting of all these people coming together to talk about environmental funding priorities. And essentially the conclusion that Schellenberg and Nordhaus have in this paper, The Death of Environmentalism, is that the money is not really being spent very well. And partly, and the most important reason, was because they aren't getting traction on global warming. The overall thesis is, as they put it, is that the environmental community's narrow definition of its self-interest leads to a kind of policy literalism that undermines its power. And the direction they're going to go is that the environmental movement has, in part, let itself be defined and accepted a definition as a very narrow set of special interests, rather than representing an interest that everyone should have a stake in. So what they conclude we should do is, more than anything else, is take a collective step back, rethink everything, and try to turn things around, especially in issues like global warming, to step away from the tactical struggles that environmentalists have made so far and try to make something other than technical solutions as the answer, but really to appeal in a certain sense to the moral stake that we're facing. So like I said, there's sort of three sorts of problems that Schellenberger and Nordhaus identify: the category problem, the framing problem, and the vision problem. The category problem is that, as I said before, environmentalism should be abolished as a distinct category of political identification. They think we should get away from really thinking of ourselves narrowly as a small part of the electorate, but really in league with a broader part. And the reason is that we've landed in the political ghetto of special interest groups. We're just one more set of people out in the hallways of Congress to be associated with the gun lobby or other lobbies, rather than really representing an interest that everyone should have in common. And especially on climate change, begin to talk about these issues as not just environmental problems, but health problems, social welfare problems, equity problems, all the things that we know that climate change is going to affect. The framing problem, and this sort of, I think, jives quite nicely with some of the things that Albert was saying in his talk earlier today, is that the environmental movement has focused on a series of technical identifications of environmental problems. Now, this is just not to say that these aren't true. Certainly you can't understand environmental problems without understanding the science and technology behind them. But what we've sort of focused on is selling technical proposals to legislators rather than talking about the moral dimensions of the problems at hand. We've lost sight of the moral vision of doing something about global warming, and in a certain sense have not taken the route that the right has used so successfully. So the right has taken sort of an issue like abortion and monopolized on the notion of partial birth abortions to get gut reactions from people. Now there's certainly some problems with this, and also with comparing it to a problem like global warming, but what we haven't done as an environmental community is really focus on coming up with the kinds of visions that could get people to think about these as issues that they should be concerned with, and not just scientific debates in the literature. Now part of the reason, and this is one of the problems that I have with this analysis, the problem is of course that so far, the scientists have been on the defensive in terms of the debates about global warming, because of this litany of arguments that there is still some kind of confusion or disagreement in the scientific community that really didn't exist. And the press has actually been complicitous in this, I would argue, in some respects. But now we've got beyond that, and even with the exception of Fred Thompson, the front-running contenders on the Republican side all admit the reality and the truth of human-caused global warming and think that we should do something about it, not all the solutions we'd like to see them to do. In that kind of climate, we have to sort of figure out what kind of moral story to tell about the solutions at hand. The final issue they bring up is, I think, a really nice one, and I think this is kind of true of environmentalism in general, is that we, and I do speak as an environmentalist, have done a fantastic job of articulating nightmares, of articulating bad scenarios for the future. But we haven't done much to articulate a dream of a positive future that we could sort of embrace. And I Have a Nightmare is compelling and motivating, but only to a certain extent. It's not the kind of thing that I think will motivate people to really make the kinds of sacrifices they need to do, or to joyously embrace the sorts of new sorts of ways of living and policies that are going to be needed to take on an issue like global warming. So their conclusion is, once environmentalists can offer a compelling vision for the future, we will be in a much better position to stop being Pollyanna about the state of their politics and once again have an inspiring vision. The kind of inspiring vision that I think environmentalists once offered at the beginning stages of environmentalism, articulating a sort of a policy and a plan for preserving some of the great areas that we have around us in this part of the West. So the question is, has environmental ethics, the field of philosophy that I work in, has it been complicitous? Has it really helped in terms of taking on the problem of, is it prepared to take on a problem of global warming, or is it actually reproducing some of these problems that Schellenberger and Nordhaus identify? Earlier today, Albert gave an assessment of the field of ethics, whether or not ethics in general is well prepared and well positioned to do that, with giving them a mixed report card. And I would sort of say, with a very few exceptions that I'm happy to talk about later, most of the field of environmental ethics is not in a good position to do that because of the way that we've duplicated some of these general problems with environmentalism in the way that we've established our field. So in order to do this, I got to sort of give you a little quick and dirty history of environmental ethics, the field of philosophy that really focuses on solutions to the ethical dimensions of environmental problems, and then go through some of the distinctions in them to sort of, I think, see how they wind up there. So the first one I'll talk about is the distinction between human-centered anthropocentric versus non-human-centered, non-anthropocentric ways of thinking about moral problems. So what is the field of environmental ethics? Well, like I said, it's the field of philosophy that's devoted to thinking about the ethical dimensions of moral problems. And it's a very young field for such an old discipline and practice as philosophy, going back more than 2,000 years in the West. The field of environmental ethics really is a phenomenon that starts in the early 1970s. And it starts with the first papers. I mean, certainly there were people who were talking about the moral dimensions of environmental problems before, but in established philosophy departments, in the philosophy world, you really don't see this until the early 70s. Papers from Arne Næss, who many of you know was the founder of deep ecology, one of the first coherent schools of environmental philosophy. Richard Sylvan, who was an Australian philosopher, starting out as a logician and then sort of early on got into the field of environmental ethics. And Peter Singer, many of you know, as one of the founders of the animal liberation movement. And if you look at the sort of the different early sort of papers in the field, what were they arguing? I think they were arguing two kinds of things. And they came out, you sort of realize what they were sort of looking at. The commonality between these two kinds of things is because all these figures, all these early figures in the field, shared a very similar biography. They all were trained philosophers, but also committed environmentalists or animal welfare advocates who were working in local organizations, and they're confronted with different kinds of environmental problems, mostly working on, again, the local level. And they're sitting around, some kind of conference table with other professionals, lawyers, biologists, whatever, and people sort of go around the table and go, well, Joe, you're a lawyer, so you can talk about the natural resource a law that's relevant to, save this creek or whatever. Mary, you're a biologist, you can talk to us about the biological issues. And then sort of, Albert, you're a philosopher, so you tell us about the sort of, oh, by the way, what is philosophy, Albert? Right? And then sort of, there'd be sort of this long pause and try to explain what philosophy was. And then folks started thinking, well, what would be the contribution that philosophy would make? How could philosophers make some contribution to solving these kinds of problems? And so beginning then in the early 70s, you get this real sort of period of introspection by philosophers asking these two questions. Has there been any way, in fact, that philosophy has contributed to the creation of environmental problems that we have today? And what could philosophers contribute to the actual resolution of those problems commensurate with the talents that they have? And the two answers that come out in different ways in all three of those early contributions, and then I would say increasingly in the next 20 or so years of the field, is that in answer to the first question, how has philosophy contributed to the creation of environmental problems, that we have all these great traditions of ethics, Kantian ethics, consequentialist ethics, virtue ethics, different sort of traditions in ethics, and they're all anthropocentric, they're all human-centered. All of them explain different reasons why we have moral obligations to other persons. We can't just treat people as we would like to, but why we have particular kinds of obligations to them, moral obligations. But they stop short at that. They don't talk about how we might have moral obligations to other animals. They don't talk about how we might have moral obligations to species. They don't talk about, for different reasons, why we might have moral obligations to ecosystems. And for all those kinds of things, it seems that one can at best only have indirect arguments for why we should have moral obligations to those things. So I won't go into the details of the theory if you don't know it, but Immanuel Kant, the great sort of German philosopher of the 18th century, at one point in his corpus talks about why we should not torture puppies. Well, actually, he actually didn't talk about torturing puppies. He talks really about why you should not beat your horse in the street, right? But torturing puppies makes it kind of more vivid somehow, right? So don't see a lot of horses in the street anymore. So Kant says the reason that you shouldn't torture puppies is because if you engage in these acts of torturing innocent animals, it will inure you towards doing things like causing harm to other persons. You'll just get used to sort of causing this kind of harm. You'll start with animals and then you'll work your way up to humans, and that would be bad. There's nothing morally wrong with the harm you do to the animal itself. It's only harmful, morally harmful by proxy. And folks like Peter Singer and sort of other figures in the field sort of said, look, that's just not good enough. There's got to be moral reasons why it's wrong to torture that puppy or do something harmful to the environment. And so in terms of answering the second question, what could philosophers contribute to the resolution of these problems commensurate with their talents, the answer was to create a non-human-centered, a non-anthropocentric theory of ethics. And that's really how the field of environmental ethics gets off the ground. That's the original move, and it leads to a bunch of different arguments in the field. Now, there are two kinds of distinctions. I'll sort of make the first one more precise, and then add the second one that I think sort of get you sort of started on your way to becoming an environmental ethicist. So like I said, this first distinction is anthropocentrism and non-anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism could be defined as the restriction of direct moral obligations only to humans. They only apply to other humans, not those puppies, not ecosystems. And then the opposition, non-anthropocentrism, we want to expand some kind of direct moral obligations to living things other than humans. So they took this early distinction and then combined it with a much older distinction in philosophy, and that's the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental value. So intrinsic value would be the worth objects have in their own right, independent of their value to any other end, and you oppose that to instrumental value, the worth objects have in fulfilling other ends. And most fields of ethics have something like this distinction going on somewhere in them. You know, humans are supposed to have some kind of intrinsic value for some reason. We have more value than the value of this clicker or the value of my watch or the microphone or the desktop computer or something. There's something about us that gives us certain kind of value regardless of our value to fulfilling the ends of someone else. And that makes us different than these artifacts in the world. So you combine these things, and what you got was a field of philosophy devoted to bringing these two things together. So we want a theory about how we can expand moral obligation to things that aren't humans by way of defining the intrinsic value of other animals, the intrinsic value of species, the intrinsic value of ecosystems. And we oppose that to the crude other way of thinking about nature, right? So if you only think of the value of nature in terms of its resource value, if you only think of the value of a forest in terms of the pulp or the timber that you can pull out of it, and you only think of the value of land in terms of its value in producing crops, right? Then you have a human-centered theory that only sees the value of nature in terms of its worth in fulfilling the ends of humans. And in technical terms, in the field of environmental ethics, if that's your view, then we call you an economist. Right? And early on in the field, that's kind of what we did, is we tried to beat up on economists. And it was really a sort of a David versus Goliath kind of matchup, except David doesn't do so well, I can tell you, in this matchup. But you can sort of see this sense in the early papers in the field. So that figure, Richard Sylvan, I sort of mentioned before, this is just from the first paragraph of his first paper in 1973 on environmental ethics. Sylvan says, "It's increasingly said that civilization, Western civilization at least, stands in need of a new ethic and derivatively of a new economics, setting people's relation to the natural environment, and in Aldo Leopold's words, many of you will know Leopold, an ethic dealing with the human relation to land and the animals and plants which grow upon it. It's not, of course, that old and prevailing ethics do not deal with the human relationship to nature. They do, but on those prevailing views, humans are free to deal with nature as they please, that is, their relations with nature, insofar at least as they do not affect others, are not subject to moral censure." We can say that the farmer who dumps some kind of toxic substance into the stream that goes through his land does something stupid, does something imprudent, but as long as there are no other farmers down there, down in the watershed who are going to suffer, then he's not doing anything morally wrong because there's no moral subject that he's doing anything wrong to. And of course, a lot of us do have the intuitions that the farmer is doing something wrong, and that gets the field kind of going. Brian Norton, one of the next generation of environmental ethicists, who's one of the first to challenge this orthodoxy in the field, that what environmental ethics really was going to be was to find this non-human-centered theory, the intrinsic value of nature. In one of his first attacks on it, certainly points to the same set of issues. So Norton says, the question of whether this field of ethics is going to be distinctive, that's Sylvan's question, whether we really need a new theory in ethics to deal with the environment, is it taken as equivalent to the question of whether an environmental ethic must reject anthropocentrism. Environmental ethics is seen as distinctive with respect to standard ethics if and only if environmental ethics can be founded upon principles which assert or presuppose that non-human natural entities have value independent of human value. So those human-centered folks, those anthropocentrists, are therefore taken to believe that every instance of value originates in a contribution to human values, and that all elements of nature can at most have value instrumental to the satisfaction of human interests. In other words, you're either an enlightened environmental ethicist or you're Milton Friedman, right? And that doesn't sound like a good choice. Yeah, you get right down to it. So in terms of the category problem that Schellenberger and Nordhaus accuse all environmentalists of, environmentalism as a kind of special interest, I would want to say that traditional environmental ethicists are guilty of this category problem. That if you're going to do environmental ethics, it has to be in this way. It has to be looking at these non-human-centered versions of ethical theory and discounting all the rest of it. Now, there are lots of minority traditions represented by many of the people in the room here today that I think were first passed over and now coming to the fore. And I'll talk about one of them in a second in more detail. The Among these alternative views, early on, there was a guy named John Passmore, a colleague of Richard Sylvan's actually in Australia, who published a wonderful book that's almost never read anymore by contemporary figures called Man's Responsibility for Nature. And Passmore sort of says, look, we just need to go back to something like the Christian stewardship tradition to look to find ample resources to come up with reasons why people ought to treat the environment in a better way. A view unfortunately called weak anthropocentrism, because like, who wants to say, I'm a weak anthropocentrist? You know, hold up your hands. Which was identified by Norton, who I mentioned before, and also by Jean Hargrove, the editor of the journal Environmental Ethics. And the claim there was, look, not all human-centered ways of valuing the environment are bad. They're not all the crude, caricature of what economists are. There are other ways that people value things, from a human-centered perspective, but they often overlap with very strong arguments for environmental protection. They don't give those direct arguments for why the species have value or the ecosystems have value, but they give really powerful indirect arguments. So represented here on the left, aesthetic values, right? The sense in which beautiful things often morally motivate people to protect the environment. And in all the environmental legislation that we've passed since the early 1970s, there is some kind of appeal to aesthetic values. What you also find on the right side are appeals to future generations, obligations to the future, right? Again, we think if we think we have positive moral obligations to the future, then these are going to entail very strong reasons why to protect the environment. And then kind of two more recent ones, sort of a pragmatist version of these kinds of concerns that Albert sort of mentioned, I've been sort of working on for a while. And what I'm going to talk about sort of next is ways of thinking about environmentalism, environmental concern as a kind of a civic duty. Variously called civic environmentalism or ecological citizenship, of really sort of thinking about our duties to the environment as coextensive with our duties to the people around us, in the same way we have civic obligations to be concerned about things like public education. So let's move to the framing problem. And I want to sort of look at sort of just one kind of example of what I think is the framing problem that the field of environmental ethics is some way picked up from the larger environmental community and also given sort of lots of intellectual support for. And that's between identity and what I just mentioned, the citizenship model. Anyone recognize the picture on the left? The tree is Luna. The girl is actually Julia Butterfly Hill, who we all sort of know, sort of icon of the environmental movement, who spent years in the tree Luna to save it. And then on the right, a bunch of my friends sort of working on a restoration project in Chicago, and sort of come back to them sort of later. Okay, so what do I mean by this? I think that the traditional environmental movement, and you sort of see this picked up in different ways in the field of environmental ethics, especially from, say, the deep ecology tradition, sort of other traditions like that. I've tried to sort of say that what does it mean to be an environmentalist? It means to have some kind of very special identity with nature, and that identity can be captured in different kinds of ways. I'm going to give you sort of three versions of it and three sort of very brief examples of how I think these versions come up in the history of the field, and then we can sort of come back in discussion and tease them out more if you want to. So the first one would be some kind of claim that the proper environmental consciousness, or even the proper self, what it is to really be the right kind of human being, requires a particular kind of environment. And if you don't have access to that particular kind of environment, or if you live in a different kind of environment, then you don't have that kind of environmental consciousness. And in North American environmentalism, we've seen this in some of the early figures in the focus on wilderness. And if you've read your Muir, parts of Thoreau, especially when he's climbing Mount Katahdin, and other early American figures, you sort of see the sort of focus on the importance of these particular places is because they produce this kind of character. So Bob Marshall, who actually had a much more complicated view at the end of his life, but sort of early on, put it this way. As long as we prize individuality and competence, it is imperative to provide the opportunity for complete self-sufficiency. This is inconceivable under the effete superstructure of urbanity. It demands the harsh environment of untrammeled expanses. Now, when I first read this, I was living in Manhattan. So I was disturbed, right? Oh my God. I don't live in Greenwich Village. I live in the effete superstructure of urbanity. Jesus. Get out of here. So just sort of one thing is certain kinds of places produce that consciousness, others don't. And I think that this, although this is an older version, you can find this, and sort of we can talk about this later, you can find that even, I think, in contemporary writers like E.O. Wilson will sometimes talk about the importance of wildness and wilderness in terms of how it's a necessary condition for really being a complete person. Another version of this sort of claim. The proper environmental consciousness requires a particular kind of experience, right? So not just a particular kind of environment, but a particular kind of experience in that environment. And if you don't have the right kind of experience, then you're not going to achieve the right kind of a consciousness and be the right kind of environmentalist. And I think you find this especially in the New World proponents of deep ecology. When deep ecology first went from Norway, where Arne Næss was from, to this side of the Atlantic, you really got to focus in the early sort of American and I would also argue Australian recipients of the theory that this was really about experience. It was really about preserving a particular kind of experience. So Bill Duvall and George Sessions put it in the very first anthology ever published on deep ecology in the US. Most people in the deep ecology movement have had the feeling, usually but not always in nature, that they are connected with something greater than their ego, greater than their home, their family, their special attributes as an individual, a feeling that is often called oceanic because many have it on the ocean. Without that identification, without that right kind of experience, one is not easily drawn to become into the proper form of environmentalism, in this case, deep ecology. Third example. The proper environmental consciousness or even the proper self requires a particular kind of spiritual experience. So it's not just enough to be in the right place and to see that place in the right way, but to really be the right kind of environmentalist who can properly call yourself an environmentalist. You've got to have a spiritual relationship with that place. Julia Butterfly Hill puts it this way in her book, The Legacy of Luna. When I entered the majestic cathedral of the Redwood Forest for the first time, my spirit knew it had found what it was searching for. I dropped to my knees and began to cry because I was so overwhelmed by the wisdom, energy, and spirituality housed in this holiest of temples. Now, I'm not going to suggest for a moment that any of these individual testimonies are wrong, right? What I am going to have a problem with is the idea that this kind of view is the only way of describing what it really means to have environmental concern. And that the kinds of policies and solutions and attitudes and structures of the world that are put forward out of the view that they have to somehow recreate this for everyone is really going to be the way that we should tackle a problem like global warming. So kind of just briefly, what I sort of think is wrong with these models. The real environmentalists out there are the ones who have the right kind of identity with nature. Everyone else just doesn't get it. I think it's exclusionary. It creates us against them, right? It would cause me to see my parents, well-meaning, wonderful people, not as an ally, a potential ally in the struggle against global warming, but an impediment, because they never have had these kind of experiences, and if they did, they just wouldn't see it in the right way. I think it tends towards an assault on different environmental views by labeling. So, if you're not first, you're a Guinness, and we're going to sort of label you as such. So if you're not a deep ecologist in the way the distinction was at first made, you're a shallow ecologist. Now, it's like weak anthropocentrism. Shallow ecologists, stand up. Don't want to do that. For another school of environmental thought, it was environmentalism versus ecologism. The ecologisms really knew what they were about. The environmentalists were the old sort of shallow kind of version. I think it leads to a tendency to make very spurious claims about the other side, the people who don't get it, in a way that sort of weakens our capacities for alliances. So Arne Næss at one point said, and he's since retracted this, anthropocentric arguments weaken motivation to fight for necessary social changes and willingness to serve great causes. So if you think that the reason, for example, we should take on a problem like global warming is because you're concerned about about future generations of humans, you're just not going to be willing to serve the great causes. You won't be willing to make the great sacrifices that are necessary, right? And I think, to get to a discussion we're going to have later, you won't have the proper vision that will really motivate for people to do the things that they need to do. And I think it's also susceptible to very contentious hierarchical claims, right? I know what's better because I'm closer to the earth than you are, I'm closer to, I've made I have had the proper kinds of experiences, and so I have more of an understanding of what needs to be done. Now, for various reasons I'll sort of get into, I think incurring these kinds of problems is not going to entail the kind of big tent that's going to be necessary to really get the traction we need on a problem like global warming. Indeed, I would say on any kind of environmental problem. But we'll focus it later on global warming. My favorite comedian, I hope if you don't, two recommendations I'm going to make here. One is going to be movies you should watch. One will be books you should read in what's left of the summer. Go out and rent any Eddie Izzard video. You'll thank me for it later. But Eddie Izzard, my sort of favorite comedian, has this sort of issue called I want to call the flag problem. So I think sort of this problem, this category problem, is sort of like what Eddie Izzard calls the flag problem. And so he tells a story about how did the British conquer India, right? So you got all these people in India, sort of guys sail up in these boats, you know, and they come out and they say, I claim this country in the name of the Queen. And put down their flags. And the people in India go, you can't claim us. I mean, we live here, right? And so the British say, do you have a flag? Well, no. No flag, no country. So we win, right? And I think it has gotten that way in some parts of the environmental movement, right? If you can't properly define yourself under the flag and the way that we sort of recognize it, then you're missing something and you can't be part of the solution. Now, opposed to this, I think, is this, it's just one alternative. There are many alternatives that people could articulate, is I think this notion of civic environmentalism, ecological citizenship, which a bunch of people have started to work on now. I think most notably a political theorist in Britain named Andy Dobson, who's at Keele University. It's a great book just called Civic Environmentalism. It's sort of a one-day read, and it really sort of summarizes the intuitions behind that. So instead of sort of saying what it means to be an environmentalist or really be committed to the environment is to be identified with a natural other by dint of some kind of experience or something like that, we should really think about environmental activity. The responsibility for the environment is generated out of our communal obligations to our fellow citizens. We think of ourselves as caring for the environment, identify with environmental concern because of our strong connection with the people around us and our sense of wanting to build a stronger community. Now, not different really than the kinds of other sorts of ways you can think of being a good citizen, like being a member of the PTA or, you know, working at a battered women's shelter, or sort of any sort of number of issues. But here we sort of think of, you know, taking part in community gardens, taking part in local community food banks, helping to do a restoration project on an urban stream. These kinds of things, the motivation to doing that being because we have obligations to our citizens to help to make our community better. What would be the advantages of trying to remodel environmentalism in this way, using this kind of language? One is that citizenship is attached to, in this sense, democratic citizenship and democratic participation. So the notion of sort of drawing lines, I'm better than you, sort of I know more than you because I've had the right kinds of experiences, doesn't seem to have as much of a chance of getting a toehold. Because it's not just to be involved in these sorts of projects, but also be attuned to the democratic nature of decision-making processes, and also the idea that you could be outvoted, right? That you have to accept when people disagree with you, and then in fact, allowing yourself to be put in that position strengthens the whole community. Because at the end of the day, and this is just something we think about in standard democratic theory going back thousands of years, makes the community stronger. The ideal, and certainly the way that citizenship is talked about in this country, the ideal is certainly not always met, is that you want to go towards universal inclusivity rather than exclusivity. Certainly citizenship can be used as a way of dividing lines between us and them, but it's always begging this question. Why aren't we including more people in who we define as the community around us? And this notion of citizenship that I'm talking about here isn't one where you sort of say, okay, you're an American or you're not or something like that, but really sort of an older tradition that really goes back to the Greeks more, of thinking about citizenship as the kinds of conditions of having positive obligations to the people around you rather than just simply the obligation to let them alone to fulfill whatever preferences that they might have. That should be 3. Citizenship in this sense authorizes the actions connected to it. We don't worry whether citizens are experts or have had the right experiences. merely that they have a kind of commitment to the community in some kind of way. So the verdict I'd have here is that to avoid the framing problem that Schellenberger and Nordhaus have, we just go to different kinds of conceptions of what counts as environmentalism or what counts as a right kind of environmental solution, that we should try to not sort of define just what counts as a proper environmentalist, but come up with a more open framework that really is inclusive of more people living in different kinds of places. And indeed, if you look at the literature here, I think actually Bob Marshall towards the end of his life, Arne after he sort of said some of those other things, and others have really come around to something like this kind of idea. Now finally, so far most of this talk has been critical, what's wrong with environmental ethics, what's wrong with environmentalism. Here I want to sort of say something more positive and constructive. What about the vision? What's the right kind of vision that we could articulate other than I have a nightmare, right, in terms of thinking about global warming? Let me just start with an observation. And this is something that after a number of years, not of writing, but just sort of thinking about and talking to people about global warming, is I think that we're caught between two visions of the future right now, if you really take this debate seriously. And one of them is unthinkable and the other one is unimaginable. And that often puts us in a state of paralysis about this particular issue. The unthinkable is thinking about the consequences of global warming, all those bad things that could happen, and the other kinds of problems that would create for humans and non-humans, the sort of disasters that we see as possibly around the corner. And the unimaginable is what kind of changes would be required to actually do something about it. When you look at the kinds of changes in everyday life that are thought to be necessitated by really changing the whole structure of our economy in some ways. And what makes us even more depressed is when we look at the statistics, especially in this country, on how people respond to a problem like global warming. This is from the Pew Charitable Trust sort of project on global warming, looking at sort of how relatively Americans are concerned with global warming versus others. Things have gotten better since the time this poll was taken, less than a year ago. But then you sort of had the worst sort of numbers coming from the United States in terms of how people are concerned with global warming. And when you sort of look at those kinds of statistics, it really makes it really adds fuel to that fire of the unimaginable. So we have to talk about imagining different kinds of solutions. And I'm going to sort of give you sort of four kinds of solutions, but really focus on the fourth one. So the three first ones I'm just going to sort of pass over pretty quickly in terms of the kinds of priorities and kinds of changes that we obviously need to think about. And the last one, I think, sort of will most clearly speak to this notion of the vision problem. So after you've rented your Eddie Izzard video, then go pick up these three books from Kim Stanley Robinson, if you haven't heard of them. 40 Signs of Rain, 50 Degrees Below, and 60 Days and Counting. And Kim Stanley Robinson is a wonderful science fiction writer. This is his answer to that noted climatology expert, Michael Crichton. Right? You're called before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee to testify on global warming. You must be, right, an expert climatologist, right? I mean, it stands to reason, don't it? So in this wonderful trilogy that's all set in Washington, D.C., Robinson has kind of an answer to Crichton's skepticism about global warming and really imagines a future. And it's sort of like, remember those days when we used to watch The West Wing and go, my real president is Jed Bartlett, right? Remember those days? We were in denial, but it was fun, for an hour. So here you get the sort of the approach sort of a president following someone who looks suspiciously like our current president, who really takes global warming very, very seriously as his agenda, just as really horrible sort of impacts are starting to hit Washington, D.C. And it starts with a Katrina-like event hitting D.C. So that really wakes everyone up, when the mall is completely flooded. But one of the things you get in this trilogy is it possible that there are going to be just emergency responses that we're going to have? Now, I share, and this is something that Albert sort of expressed skepticism about earlier today, and I completely share this view, that the whole idea that we can just sort of engineer our way out of global warming by, putting giant mirrors, in the sky or, darkening the atmosphere is bunk. But one of the interesting things you get in this trilogy is if things got really, really, really bad, and it looked like the thermohaline cycle was going to shut down, then would it actually be possible to pump enough salt into the North Atlantic to restart it, and sort of things like that. So it's sort of worth kind of entertaining these views, at least insofar as we can sort of remind ourselves we don't want to get to that point. Secondly, adaptation, or 2A adaptation, but a just form of adaptation. Now, Bjorn Lomborg, the Danish statistician, author of The Skeptical Environmentalist, not a global warming skeptic, but certainly a skeptic of really spending our resources on mitigating, possibly mitigating climate change as a way of solving global warming because of where we ought to spend our money. And he puts it sort of this way: we should really be putting more money into adaptation rather than mitigation, because eventually, in 3 generations, the next 3 generations down the road, people in Bangladesh, because of globalization and other kinds of things, are going to have more income, and they might wonder, why do we spend all those resources on trying to mitigate global warming and then hence slow down the economy, according to critics like Lomborg, which would have benefited their grandfather and father before them? Wouldn't they justly sort of say, you did the wrong thing, because you could have actually been trying to make these people's lives better, spending those resources on flood control, on clean water for developing areas, on coming up with new cures for malaria, all the kinds of things we might sort of imagine we need to adapt to climate change, instead of spending all this money on mitigation, because we're not certain that it was going to work anyway. So certainly we sort of imagine a lot of adaptation that's going to happen. As my colleague Steve Gardner puts it, we've already committed ourselves to 1 degree temperature increase. That seems like inevitable. It's going to happen. And the possible impacts that that's going to cause. We might have committed ourselves to 2 unless we can really do something really ambitious like Kyoto. And so we already know there are going to be those rising sea levels, so there has to be some kind of adaptation, which in a sort of a good liberal justice framework should benefit the least well off, right? Should be spent into helping the future sort of people who are going to be hit by events like Katrina, and not the people who own wealthy houses on the Outer Banks. So that's a sort of another sort of solution. Resourceful mitigation, mitigation that can pay for itself, and this is where we sort of think about emissions trading and sort of a future of non-carbon-based energy. The question that I have, after you sort of think about just briefly those sorts of considerations, what if this mitigation and what if these attempts at adaptation ultimately, what if that kind of stuff is ultimately impossible? This is the kind of thing that Lomborg and sort of other skeptics are kind of worried about. And this gives them a reason to favor adaptation over mitigation. What if it's the case that we knew today, or we sort of had very good reason to believe today, that we were ultimately going to be, we only had a certain chance of being successful in our attempts to mitigate climate change? And the answer sort of that you get mostly in the literature is, well, if you use the precautionary principle, there's lots of reasons against doing nothing. And we're in a condition of maximum uncertainty. We don't know the tipping points for lots of these irreversible or catastrophic outcomes. But in terms of articulating a vision, I think the precautionary principle, we should really be cautious about the future, is not kind of doing enough, even in the face of the uncertainty about what we can actually do about this problem. So for that one reason, I want to sort of advocate something I want to give this awkward term to foresight responsibility. And I want to pose it in a kind of a thought experiment about what would happen if we spent all these resources, did all these things to motivate people to make sacrifices now. Would it really be worth it in the long run? And the philosophical context I want to put this in is an early book about a little over 10 years ago by Avner Deschelette, who's a wonderful environmental ethicist. This was actually his dissertation at Oxford, Why Posterity Matters. It was about sort of why we have obligations to future generations, especially in an environmental context. And I won't go into the details of all the different philosophical views that he's sparring against, but one of the things that Deschelette does in this is he sort of says part of our motivation and part of our actual obligations to the future are driven by what we want them to think of us. And there's particular reasons why he puts the claim in this term, but I think it's a really interesting and compelling one. And Deschelette wants to claim that we have some kind of moral motivation to really want people in the future to think that we tried to do right by them, even if we don't know that we're actually going to do right by them. And I think that's kind of compelling. And the kinds of examples I want to sort of give are these two sort of sets of examples, right? If we did nothing, would that be better than trying to do something even if it doesn't work? So think of these two sets of examples. Do we think better of, for example, resistors in the Warsaw Ghetto, even though they ultimately failed? The anarchists and Trotskyists in the Spanish Civil War, even though they ultimately failed? Do we think that they did the wrong thing to try, even in the face of, in many of these cases, insurmountable odds? And if you don't like those actual examples, think about it counterfactually, right? What would we think about the North in the US Civil War, which was actually won by the South? Would we think that they did the right thing in trying? What would we think about the Allies in World War II, in a World War II scenario that are won by the fascists? Would we think that they did right in trying if we understood the facts of sort of what were people standing for, what were the causes of the war, and what was happening in those kinds of situations? And I think embracing, in all of these cases, people were not only, I believe, fighting only for themselves, but really struggling for a future. And in part, I think we can look back and sort of admire them for what they did in these cases of uncertainty. And that notion of trying to do right by the future, even in the face of uncertainty, provides a kind of vision, a kind of an answer to this vision problem. Provides a different kind of dream, that we do right by the future even though we don't know whether we will, rather than just articulating the possible nightmares that could result. So with that, I'll stop, and thanks. Take some questions.
That's a great talk, Andrew. Thanks very much. I guess a few times, though, I was wondering whether there might have been perhaps some false dilemmas that were posed.
Okay.
So when you were talking about the death of environmentalism, there was a framing issue as if it were a technical, scientific way of framing the issue or a moral way of framing the issue, one that gets at your gut. But of course, those aren't incompatible.
Right.
You could frame it in both ways. And that got me thinking, when you were talking about the different approaches you could have to the environment, say that the value you could get in these, I think you called it the identity kinds of issues, that the person you could be from these on the basis of these transformative experiences, spiritual or conscious otherwise. And you gave that its fair shake, but you said ultimately I favor a view where it's more democratic, environmental citizenship and so on. But again, that seems like, why not both, really? So why not say the environment can lead to these transformative experiences? And why not say that we have a kind of democratic obligation to others? It seems like we don't get confused. Wait, there are two here. Why not both? Really?
It's a great question, and you're right. I mean, I think you could have, in the first case, the first worry that you had. I think you have to have both, and that's where I want to talk about kind of figuring out what the role that ethicists are going to have in this kind of debate. In the second case. Could you have both the sort of the identity-based and the sort of the community-based sort of notions of environmentalism? I think yes, you could. I think unfortunately there's too many examples in the history of environmentalism where people have sort of said that one excludes the possibility of the other, right? Now, but this could be a corrective on that, right? So the example that I'll give here is that, and I've written a number of pieces on that, there's been this historical blind spot, for example, in environmental ethics towards talking about cities, And the reason is because on the sort of the dominant view of the field, the focus is to come up with a non-human centered description of the intrinsic value of nature. Why is it nature is special? The only kinds of environments that could possibly embody this value are the wild environments, are the environments that aren't made by humans. Those things are just artifacts. Those are just instruments, right? Those things don't have the kind of value that, properly speaking, an environmental ethicist is supposed to try to unpack. And and we can talk about sort of the theoretical reasons for that, why that is. I don't think all environmental ethicists are guilty of that, but I think there's traditionally been blinkers to talk about those kinds of issues, to talk about agricultural ethics as well, that Paul Thompson sort of spent his career sort of talking about. For similar reasons, environmental ethicists have said, we don't have to talk about agriculture because that's not the environment, right? That's just this sort of man-made landscape, which is beyond the pale now, right? It's kind of silly, of course, because both of these landscapes, how can you talk about one without the other? They're obviously physically interrelated. And then my experience has been that I've sort of seen this in not philosophical terms, but in the antipathy that some environmentalists have had towards cities as really being seriously, part of the environmental movement, a part that needs to be taken seriously. And again, there's sort of examples out there. You can sort of find it in the writings of Ed Abbey, and in addition to lots of other problems that you can find in the writings of Ed Abbey, despite the very interesting literature. So that would be sort of a cautionary tale. We wouldn't want to say you can't talk about one's spiritual relationship to nature, even if you think of environmentalism as a really community-based thing. It would be great. But to sort of say that the only proper way of understanding one's true obligations to nature is through some sort of spiritualism, that's the word that
Sure. And my worry, I guess, is that you, maybe I just wasn't listening carefully, but that your language sometimes, here's a better framework rather than just here's an alternative framework that should be included.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, and then add one thing to the first question that you asked on the technical versus the moral dilemmas there. The scientists have done a fantastic job, right? And this is sort of just to take a page out of the way Albert put it earlier today. But what are we going to contribute as philosophers? It's not going to be, helping with the ice core samples. We don't have the training, right? Or the funding, right, to go to Antarctica. That's too bad, right? Yeah. We're not going to help on that dimension. And I sort of said there are a number, very small, but a very important number of philosophers who have not fallen into, I think, these traditional dilemmas in the field. Clark Wolf here in the back, Henry Shue at Oxford, my colleague Steve Gardner at University of Washington, Dale Jamieson at NYU, sort of other folks who I wouldn't really put in terms of that traditional sort of set of distinctions who have been sort of making a lot of progress on climate change. But I think we're still struggling on what our role is going to be, with respect to the larger debate. It's not going to be adding the technical dimensions of the problem. What else is it going to be? I don't think it's going to be saying, this is a really morally bad situation. I think people understand that. They get that intuitively. My colleague Steve Gardner has a wonderful paper about climate change being the perfect moral storm in terms of distributional problems between developing countries and developed countries, between different generations, wonderful stuff like that. But sort of adding more to the literature, I think, beyond what we already have in terms of this is a really complicated moral problem, we've got to find some new set of issues that we need to talk about. One of them is sort of how do we balance mitigation versus adaptation, I think is sort of one of those issues. And also I'd want to say, although we're maybe not be the best ones in terms of articulating a vision thing, but there are sort of these moments, right, in the relationship between philosophy and social movements where we have played that role. Or at least we've sort of helped in the inspiration of the people who have played that role, the philosophical influences on Martin Luther King, all sorts of examples like that. And I think that's something we should spend some time on, and that would help in this set of debates. Yeah?
I like your idea of foresight and responsibility as a part of the way forward. But right at the end, it's possible that I misunderstood what you were saying, but it seemed to me that right at the very end, you mischaracterized the argument which foresight and responsibility was designed to, or I thought you had intended to refute. It sounded like you were saying that the alternative to thinking about what to do for the future is essentially to do nothing. And what you then just spent several minutes explaining how your own board has argued that what should be done with regards to development law, specifically Bangladesh, with regards to climate change. The cynic might call it doing nothing, but one board would probably say, well, what you're doing is
adaptation.
letting the economy grow at its natural rate, rather than fearing it will burden the costs for mitigating climate change. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah. I don't think Lomborg has taken a lot of heat for lots of reasons, and I skipped over one thing on this, and I want to just take an opportunity to put it up. And certainly, I wouldn't say that he says do nothing. His focus is on adaptation, and that's right. I mean, the question is, though, how much can we possibly adapt to in terms of how we think about the future scenarios? And this is another slide that I got from Jeff Keel at NCAR. And this is a sort of interesting slide when you sort of think about the possible future scenarios we're talking about. It's an unusual slide because mostly we're the Keeling, with the Keeling curve slides and stuff, it's sort of going in a different kind of direction. This is millions of years, going back into the past, right? So this is not a sort of a future scenario, but this is going back into the past. And what this slide sort of does is it sort of takes the IPCC projections on global mean temperature and then maps it onto the temperature of the past. So this is low, medium, and high, right? And then in terms of 2200 to 2300, the high climate sensitivity estimates and the low climate sensitivity estimates, if we do nothing to mitigate. So this is just, we grow the economy, right? We focus only on adaptation. We don't do anything about mitigation. So you're looking at, like here, if we were to just take this one, or even here, what we're looking at is going back to a planet 20 million years ago. Now we have no idea what that would be like to live in under the best scenarios for adaptation. And these are kind of the statistics that are chilling. These are the things that wake me up in the middle of the night, right? These are the things when we think about the unimaginable consequences, right, are there. Now, do we have any kind of certainty that any of this is going to happen? Certainly not any degree of hard scientific certainty. But even the possibility of kind of living within this kind of world, the reasonable scientific possibility, I think leads us to sort of say we could never only pursue a strategy of adaptation. We'd have to at least pursue some degree of mitigation in order, I think, again, part of the motivation would be to be responsible to the future that we will never see, right? And I think that's kind of the hard nut I think we need to get around, and hopefully one of the things that I think that ethicists can add to this debate. Yeah.
You had mentioned, about the North and the South and Civil War and the Allies with fascism in World War II. Do you believe that there are any parties or groups or individuals that stand to gain anything by climate change?
No, I don't. And the reason I don't is this. I mean, to say there are going to be winners and losers in climate change is kind of like saying there are winners and losers in the market for organs right now, right? So, right now people in India, other developing countries are selling their kidneys on the market to rich people in the North. So they're winners and losers, right? They're the people who lose their kidneys, and they're winners. The people like me, who I could sort of drink myself to death and kind of need, or close to death, right? Need a kidney transplant, not have relatives willing to give it to me, but I can buy one on the open market, so I'm a winner, And I mean, that's morally repugnant, obviously, to sort of say that those conditions as they exist now really mean there are people who stand to gain. And I think that's the same thing we sort of see in climate change. Will it be people who are more directly impacted than those that are less directly impacted? Sure, there will be. But do we really want to say that we benefit, from, possibly being able to grow, Pinot Noirs in Missoula or something like that, in the short term? And I just want to say no, because it would really be getting an advantage at the severe expense of others. Yep.
There's, to my mind, a very compelling argument that the lack of ethical consideration that led to a lot of the environmental problems is derivative of sort of the early modern epistemological split, the Cartesian split, and the resultant radical othering, and the resultant sort of denial of moral consideration. I was wondering where you might have sort of the, within these, what can environmental philosophers do to contribute to help to combat the problem? To what extent fostering epistemological rehabilitation or something like that might factor in?
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine something sort of like that. I mean, I'm not the kind of philosopher who thinks that all distinctions or dualisms are bad. In fact, I think some of them are quite nice. And I think Descartes is a great whipping boy, for lots of folks. But you got to have someone to be against, I suppose. But generally, the thrust behind your question, yeah, I would say they're absolutely true. I mean, I think this is something that is behind the spirit of pragmatism. Is to sort of say the idea that we can sort of really seriously contribute to the discussion of actual problems in the world by imagining we can start from nothing, right, seems to be an illusion, right? That you can't imagine, right, those kinds of severe sort of dichotomies as a way of sort of getting off the ground. Really, a really sophisticated discussion. You might be able to make some kinds of interesting moves. I think that would be very, very helpful. But yeah. Now, do I think that means reasons that all philosophers need to start changing the way they do philosophy, right, in the age of global warming? No, I don't think so, because I think there's a lot of really interesting things that philosophers are doing that have nothing to do with this problem or sort of any other sorts of problems we've been talking about today. But yeah, I mean, I can imagine sort of that as being one way you'd sort of go at that. Now, is that really the thing the ethicists need to do? Not so sure, but yeah.
In discussing the problems of uncertainty, you offered the notion of foresight responsibility. I'm not familiar with the phrase foresight responsibility.
I just made it up.
Okay. It seems awkward to me, and I would suggest that there are more natural ways of talking about it. And here are some. It's natural to talk about a duty of care, a duty of diligence, a duty to act as prudently as one can. Prudence and foresight are etymologically the same words, of course. It's natural to talk about and to understand that we have a duty to bring our skills and knowledge to bear in confronting whatever problem we have. And it's natural to say that we've got a duty to do the best we can under whatever the circumstances may be. So I think those are more established ways of talking about what you were calling foresight responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, the only thing is that you'd have to add, I don't know why I'm pointing over here, you'd have to add something about care, but not just care in general, right? Care for the future under the following conditions. So I just tried to squeeze it into those two words, but you're right. I think, got to come up with something a little bit more elegant, I don't know, sort of standing up. I have a dream, foresight, responsibility. But I take it that that's the job of like the sort of the great rhetoricians and political folks will sort of figure out. Yeah.
One word that comes to my mind when I hear the word anthropocentrism versus non-anthropocentrism, this theme that seems to be running through is the word integrative. I'm thinking in terms of like allopathic versus naturopathic medicine, which are two, facets of medicine. And then somebody like Andrew Weil comes along, who is an MD, and calls it integrative medicine, where it takes both.
Yeah.
And it just seems to me like that is my one word or concept that might be of value in this debate.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, there actually have been a few attempts to sort of come up with a way of thinking about ecological concern that doesn't make these divisions between whatever we want to call natural and whatever we don't want to call non-natural, as sort of integrative ecology. And I think that could be some value in pursuing that, yeah.
You use a lot of sort of, in this I have a dream thing that implied sort of parallels to the civil rights movement and whatnot. I was wondering if, to the extent that you call the civil rights movement Martin Luther King, to the extent that you call that movement successful or somebody does, are there sort of ethical considerations or like motivational ways to look at the civil rights movement that might be helpful for environmentalists in terms of like motivating people, like in terms of civic environmentalism. I don't know if it's that situation.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about it. I'm not as good a student of social movements, as I wish I was, to really sort of think about the possible comparisons, though. I mean, one thing that a colleague, Des Gasper, who's a wonderful sort of guy who works in development ethics in the Netherlands, sort of pointed out the first time I sort of took a pass at trying to sort of describe what I was thinking about in terms of this particular issue, the foresight responsibility stuff, is he sort of said, well, the problem is that the people in the civil rights movement saw the nightmare, why weren't they compelled to sort of say, I have a nightmare rather than why was I have a dream? Why did it get so much traction? Is because the nightmare was so clear, and if you had any doubt, you just turned on your television, right? And you saw, the fire hoses and dogs and, out there and sort of, and these really sort of strong sort of images, and imagine, could we sort of maintain that kind of future? And that's where, like, I Have a Dream had such wonderful sort of resonance because no one had to sort of imagine the nightmare. They saw it in front of them. And I would only hope that we don't have to get to that, right? Now, this is part of the worry that I have with the attempts by the environmental community to do things like, and we were talking about this in a class we're having this week, about using things like Katrina, as the nightmare, right? So you sort of point to that and kind of go, look, we told you. Here it is. It's right before your eyes. The problem with that kind of approach is it's too easy to deny it, right? You just wait another season, and the things aren't happening here that people would have predicted would have happened because of climate change or something like that. It's too easy to insert into uncertainty in the literature. Do we know for a fact, right, that climate change is causing this kind of intensity in hurricanes? Well, we have really good reason to believe there's a causal connection that will continue into the future, and you sort of get into this, and it starts weakening these kinds of explanations. So I think there's sort of really some hazards with pointing to those kinds of issues and trying to raise them as the specter that will be the contrast, the nightmare that will be the contrast to the dream. So there's some worries kind of there. I think that, not that one would sort of say, to go back to the sort of winners and losers sort of question, are there winners and losers? One could sort of say, well, the great thing about global warming is now we can repackage this as a sort of a global works projects initiative, because there'll be all this great work we'll have to do for adaptation, all this great work we'll have to do for mitigation. And this gives us new reasons to get behind some sort of stronger healthcare policy because of all the possible bad. And it just begins to sound really bizarre, right? It's fantastic that the world is burning up, right? Because, this gives us a jobs bill. And that just sort of begins to sound sort of perverse too. But I think there is this kind of way in which the civil rights movement was able to say, even if you think you're insulated from these problems because you don't live in Mississippi or something like that, you're really not. Because what this is really about, right, is the character of the nation, right, the character of the people that we aspire to be. Who are, and to go back even earlier to Lincoln, who are the better angels of our nature, right? And that I find sort of something that the environmental movement, in some ways, you've sort of seen moments of this in the past, but we really, I think, need to sort of come up with some way of encapsulating that into the future. Like, how much better will it be when we're powered by the sun rather than, powered by coal, right? Yeah, Clark?
Defending environmental protection or defending appropriate responses to global warming in terms of yet a new environmental values category might be the wrong way to go. It seems to me the strongest political and moral arguments are the arguments that are based on the simplest and most widely accepted foundations. Mm-hmm. And in the case of global warming, we have really simple arguments available to us. We don't want to enrich ourselves at cost to our impoverished descendants. right? Or we don't want to harm our descendants. And one of the concerns is that our present way of life is going to perpetrate horrible harms on those people whom we want to think well of ourselves, of us. So I'm wondering whether, I mean, in presenting foresight responsibility as the clincher of your argument, you risk depriving yourself of these other very powerful motives that I think should be foremost on our plate if we're ethicists and environmentalists arguing for appropriate public action.
Yeah, I mean, well, again, sort of to go back, to the first exchange we sort of had, I'm not sort of saying this is the only way to go by any stretch of the imagination, but I am trying to capture something I think that it's certainly, the idea is generated out of a book about obligations to future generations, right? So clearly it's on all fours with that sort of literature, I think, and reliant on that in terms of making a certain kind of rigorous argument about what our obligations to the future would sort of be. But I want also to sort of come up with some way of talking about not just of our obligations in simpliciter, but our obligations in the face of the possibility that we fail, right? And using that as a kind of a motivation. That's sort of, wanting people to think you did well even if you didn't do, right, what you set out to do. I think, and that's important because unfortunately, I really think we have to grapple with this. This is certainly the possible future that we face, I mean, I am not one who sort of thinks there's no hope. I'm actually not one, and we have a lot of sort of mutual friends like Paul Baer who worked on this. If you sort of lay out the numbers, it doesn't seem all that expensive really to take on this problem if you really look at it, that we might have sort of thought that it would be. But we also know it's going to take a big effort, and it's going to take a lot of political changes in such a way that have got to be, I think, compatible with our democratic institutions, which might be, some periods of sliding back, right, before we can go forward. We don't yet have a leader in this country like Gordon Brown, and if anyone didn't see it, but try to go back and find Gordon Brown's speech yesterday to the UN, which was phenomenal, which was amazing. To see, sorry? And he's an economist, yes, absolutely. And a dour Scotsman, right, And Brown sort of saying, look, we can't imagine sort of being responsible human beings without taking on this problem, right? And that's really the kind of leadership that we sort of need. And so I'm sort of trying to sort of capture that kind of ethos and be a way to making an analogy with these other sorts of folks who we admire, who tried in the past as well. As a way of sort of answering the kind of, well, right, we should just put all our dollars into adaptation, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing is I think that, we were both at a conference at my university on climate change, and you gave a fantastic paper, right, on distributive justice, on Rawls, right, and how we can sort of use a very traditional sort of notion in philosophy, in Rawlsian liberalism, to take on sort of issues about climate change and think about the just distribution of harms and stuff. And I think the paper was flawless in terms of its philosophical argumentation, but I found really interesting the response, right, from some of the guys in the audience, right, who were sort of saying, tell me who to read, right? Just tell me, tell me, what to do, right? Do I just have to read Rawls? I mean, do I just have to tell everyone that Rawls is right and then we're done, And we're all sitting there going, well, no, certainly not, right? But, as philosophers, that's what we do. And one of the great things, I suppose, about the moral dimensions of this problem is that it's not so complicated to sort of think about it, about why it's screwy as a moral issue now. It's really, there is a sort of moral dimension that's a problem, and also thinking about the possible solutions. But I think we got to add something else, right? That extra, that taking philosophy up to 11, something, right, that is going to sort of, help with that, capturing that vision kind of thing, and hopefully some better term, but the same sense of this, I think, compatible with those kinds of arguments is needed.
Well, let's thank Andrew for a very thoughtful